Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Ophthalmology Business Podcast. We help you develop your ideal practice with help of other doctors and experts. The topics we cover include marketing, management, leadership, recruitment, HR, mindsets, and more. I'm Guido Piquet, one of the co-hosts of this podcast. Every listener of this podcast is welcome to join the Ophthalmology Business Academy at www.obacademy.org. The membership is on us, and it's our gift to you. Today, I'm excited to talk to Jeff Freedman, the Private Equity Engagement Director for Modernizing Medicine, about private equity in ophthalmology. Let's jump in. Hey, Jeff, how's it going today?
Doing great. Really appreciate being here. I really am thankful to get an opportunity to chat through how private equity is affecting ophthalmology and the broader specialties that we all work with. So thanks for letting me share.
Of course. Yeah. And thank you for joining. Before we get started, let me just take a quick moment to thank the podcast listeners for bearing with me the last few podcasts. So if you don't know, I've been having some pretty serious back issues. And so the last few podcasts I've recorded from a laptop at home with a shaky connection and probably not in the best of moods. So anyway, I feel like I have a new lease on life. So I just wanted to mention that really quick. So thank you, podcast listeners, for bearing with me. But I think from here on out, it's going to be all positive. So thank you so much. And thanks, Jeff, for letting me put that little piece in before we start talking.
Glad to have you back.
Yes, it definitely gives you a new appreciation for health and just for appreciating the things in life that you don't otherwise have an appreciation for. So hopefully that's what I take out of this, a renewed appreciation. But let's get into the topic today. This is a topic that I think is a hot topic, you could say, in ophthalmology. There's quite a bit of private equity transactions and just different movement in the industry. So before we get into the meat of the conversation, can you just give the podcast listeners just a little bit of overview of your background, where you've come from, and just kind of tell us about yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do it, Guido. I'm actually speaking today from Chicago, Illinois, which essentially is my hometown. I have a long career, which is probably a bit of an age comment, but a long career in sales and operations and management. I interestingly started years ago in the wine business. We won't spend any time on that, but I jumped into healthcare about 25 or 30 years ago. And I sort of had been through manufacturers. I had been through a number of companies that were in the dental business. I ran a dental business back in the late 90s. And then I jumped into oncology. I worked for a very large company called US Oncology, which is a large network of oncologists. And from oncology, I transferred into working for a payer. Now, I recognize the payer is a little bit less popular, but it was really a great opportunity to give me a glimpse under the tent of how payers operate. I certainly didn't spend a lot of time there, but I think I'm uniquely qualified to give you the ins and outs of a payer. But the role that was probably the most relevant here for this podcast topic is my role as CEO of Ocular Partners. Ocular Partners was a private equity-backed ophthalmology roll-up. We combined two large practices in Chicago and ultimately transacted back in September with the sale of the business to a much larger platform owned by a much larger private equity firm. And that really gave me the firsthand experience to talk somewhat intelligently about this topic. When we transacted in September, I spent a couple months in a transition role and then had the fortunate opportunity to really rethink my career. That was December of last year. And in rethinking it, I looked at a number of things, but I ultimately landed with Modernizing Medicine, which at the time I was a customer. So I had a decent familiarity with the product and the culture and the way the company operated. But they created a role that, as you indicated, is titled Private Equity Engagement Director. And the thesis here really is simple. We think that having involvement with private equity firms that are involved with the physician practice management space, so those that are buying up practices, whether it be ophthalmology or other specialties, there's value in having a relationship and ensuring that they have some understanding of where ModMed is in terms of its applications and how they can potentially help create value, increase EBITDA, and ultimately, hopefully, polish up a package for an exit. So I've been on board for about 5 months or so, and it's been really exciting to be a part of the culture here at ModMed.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. That was a great summary of your background. And it sounds like I think ModMed was smart to put you in that role because, if a PE firm is looking for efficiencies in a business and, you can directly translate how the product's going to do it, I think they're much more likely to get on board. So I think that was a smart move by ModMed to do that. And I think you're in a great position to do it because you have visibility from both sides. So let me ask you from for practices looking at potential PE transaction and they're looking to sell, I can tell you from the perspective of a practice who is privately owned, I think there are some things that are said and sometimes frighten practices about the level of control or the level of quality they'll be able to have, and it's only about the dollars and cents. But I also think, from a business perspective, there's probably a lot of good things. So what are some of the things do you think a practice should look at when they're considering this?
Yeah, it's really the core question, and I appreciate the way you framed it. Let's be upfront. Private equity ownership is not right for everybody. I think that's ultimately a decision that the lead physicians and the lead administrators will be making, but it's certainly not right for everybody. What I will say is in today's market, there's tremendous value for getting educated. What does it look like? Who are the players? Why would I do it? When you think about some things that might drive you towards a decision, I think the things that come to mind include added investment, meaning there's now a pool of capital to invest in things like new equipment, to invest in potentially new people, to potentially be a little bit more liquid with the ability to grow. I think that certainly is a very positive component of the private equity investment. I think there is definitely the opportunity to take a shared service model approach, which is to say, we all do HR. And remember, Guido, I came from a practice. My background is really running practices. So I'm not a private equity guy, but we all know that HR and compliance and marketing and IT are things that we spend a lot of our hours doing. When you can offset or offload some of those to a management company, a management entity, there is value to being able to focus exclusively on patient care. Now, the fact is that most physicians that are in private practice and independently run are very engaged with those things. And so when you transition to a private equity firm, you tend to have to step back a little bit and allow some of those services to be managed by a different entity. That can be a good thing. That can be a bad thing. I think the last comment I'd make is a lot depends on where you are in your career. If you're a physician, are you at the twilight of that career? Are you just starting out? Those kinds of factors really play into, does this make sense? I think ultimately the idea that you might lose a little freedom really is driven by certain personalities and certain relationships that I would tell you are less the norm and they're more the exception. So that sort of negative cloud that we all hear about, the reduction in freedom, I can tell you that out of private equity's mouths, the first comment is, we don't control the clinical attention of the physician. And I think that's a pretty fair rule. But ultimately, if you feel like this is an opportunity to offset some of your administrative duties, then it makes a lot of sense. It's also, lastly, my last comment here, it's an opportunity to cash out your equity. Yes, there are alternatives out there, but there's certainly a strong component of this that can be and should be financially motivated.
Yeah, that makes sense. And probably additionally practices who you mentioned, HR, different administrative components of the business, maybe it's RCM, there is something to be said about scale. So if you're a practice that, it's just maybe a few providers, a few locations, it's likely that you won't have enough scale to do things as efficiently as you can. If you're a private practice who has 20 locations, we are on the larger side, so we strive to be as efficient as private equity, but from the business perspective. But I think you're right. It probably depends on the situation, the ownership, the physician mentality in terms of how much I'm going to control my destiny. But again, Jeff, I can tell you, all of us in our world want to control everything that happens to us every day. But the reality is we have to sometimes let go of that control, because that's the only way we can grow in the things that we can really, really focus on. And I learned that lesson every day as I help grow leaders, where I have to release control and then, focus on something else, focus on the big picture. So I appreciate that you mentioned kind of, it's not right for everyone. I think that's a great way to probably put it. And so if you're going to enter into a deal, and you said, yeah, can you explain a little bit about kind of the structure of what a deal looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I just want to amplify another point you made, just to sort of put a bow on it. In many cases, practices are running very efficiently today. And when they get an investment from private equity, it's not uncommon to have those best practices from a very well-run practice be distributed out to other physicians and other groups within that network. So I think it's important to understand all ideas that are good should be shared. And sometimes that's the forum that gets created by the private equity firm. So let me go to your question, which is, what's the structure look like? And as you said earlier, there's a lot of activity in this space. My central theme is we should all be educated. Whether it's right for you or not is really a physician's decision. But the process really is a initial meeting. There's a lot of feeling out. After that initial meeting, where there's an explanation of how the business would look going forward, there's typically an NDA signed. From that NDA, there's a deep dive in terms of supplying data. So this is all about your P&L. This is all about the revenue cycle, the procedure mix, all the things that we know are daily metrics that we look at. That data is supplied after the NDA is signed to the private equity partner. They typically have some analysts that will sort of crunch it through what they call a model. And that model will typically spit out some type of EBITDA, which is a term that gets thrown around a lot. I like to think of EBITDA as profit. The actual definition is earnings, before interest, taxes, depreciation, and amortization. Essentially, it's these profit numbers, and then you pull out some numbers. But the calculation for EBITDA is core to how the offer ends up getting delivered. Once the data is supplied, the analyst does their work on the private equity side. There is often an LOI, a letter of intent, delivered, which will give a first round of expectations of what the practice is worth and how the private equity firm is looking to make the purchase. Keep in mind that this EBITDA number still needs to be validated, and there's a ton of scrutiny that goes into making sure the number's right. But that EBITDA number is basically the basis for an offer. And I'll speak just for a moment on how that actually works. So you calculate an EBITDA number. We then, on the private equity side, will add what's called a multiple to it. And that multiple really is the price that they are willing to pay. So simple example, if you're $1 million of EBITDA, again, sort of that profit number, and the private equity is tacking on what they'll call a multiple, so call it a 6x multiple, That's $6 million that you as a practice owner can expect to receive. We'll talk about how they get it, whether it's cash or equity, that's a different story. But that $6 million is what your practice is worth. So if you think about the EBITDA of $1 million, it really illustrates how sensitive that EBITDA number is for what you're going to get valued at. In other words, let's say your $1 million was not million, it was 800,000. That 6x multiple is now a sale price of 4.8 million versus 6 million. So it's a significant drop just on $200,000 of EBITDA change. So message there, EBITDA matters, and it matters whether you're transacting or it matters whether you're running an independent practice. Profit is obviously part of how we keep the doors open, the lights on, and we invest. So I think the needle here is very sensitive when it comes to the sale, but it's also sensitive when it comes to running the operations of the business. The last comment I'd make after EBITDA is calculated is there is a series of, as I indicated, sort of validating of the numbers. We think about this in a term called Q of E, which is quality of earnings. Is it accurate? Are there numbers that don't seem to make sense? This is where you really want to have a tight handle on what your profit and loss statement looks like. You want to have a tight handle on collections. You want to have a tight handle on production, revenue, and the things that go into expenses. Ultimately, there is a legal component at the end that will deal with physician contracts. How long will you be contracted to be in the practice? It's a long process, and it doesn't happen in a week or a month. 6 months is not uncommon. And frankly, it's something that is going to distract you from running the operations. But that's generally the process that's followed by most of the private equity firms.
Let me ask you just a follow-up question, because as you were kind of explaining the process, makes sense. But what about like a practice that has a rock star surgeon, and that rock star surgeon is part of a practice that potentially made some bad decisions, and when you do the book value calculation, that's not going to look good. And so, is the future potential value of the practice, is that recognized in the multiple? Is that where you're trying to figure out what the potential of that practice could be?
Yeah, that's really a very practical question, right? I mean, what you described is not that uncommon. If you think about EBITDA as sort of this profit number today, what the private equity company is doing is they're buying for future earnings, which is to say, if there is a physician that is your highest producer, but doesn't expect to be in the group past a year, then the valuation is going to reflect that. The other side of that is that if there is a physician who is underperforming, but will perform better, that is a projection that may influence in a positive way the ultimate sale of the practice. So I think the answer to your question is it really depends on how the valuation projects earnings going forward, and that is highly contingent on the negotiations on contract, the attitude of the physician, how they work within the local community, what type of production they have at the ASC, all those factors that really help you predict what the next 5 to 6 years will look like.
Right. Well, which I guess is really part of that negotiation process.
It is.
Right. It's
Very
showing,
much.
right, because looking at the balance sheet and looking at the income statements for the practice, it's going to tell a big part of the story. It's going to tell a story about the decisions that were made, but it might not tell the full story of what the potential is. And so I guess, practices considering it need to, I guess, make sure that they can intelligently communicate that value so they can get the best offer possible.
Yeah, I think absolutely.
Well, let me kind of switch gears a little bit. So you've been part of a group that went through this transaction. So you definitely have a perspective that is an insider perspective. I've heard, personally in the industry, it seems like people either love the idea or they hate the idea. I don't find a lot of people in the middle, but what can you just give me just a high level overview, your unbiased opinion of some of the positives of private equity and ophthalmology, some of the negatives of some of those investments happening?
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'll start with from my own personal experience, I was extremely fortunate to be partners with some really excellent physician leaders. We certainly had strong personalities, but people that were not only committed, but very capable in leading the clinical teams and frankly, some of the administrative teams. So for me, I was very fortunate to be on that side. I think on the positive side, if you think about healthcare and the things that are happening in terms of technology and patient engagement and the ways that we communicate to patients, the way we communicate within our network, with our physicians, with a hospital, all those sort of technology pieces require cost. And I think the reality is that if you don't have the money to invest, or frankly, you aren't really aware of the tools and parts of sort of the infrastructure that you can get at, then you're unfortunately not going to be delivering the very best patient experience. So on the positive side, most private equity sponsors have a really deep understanding of what's available to you, whether that be in the form of an IT solution, an EMR or a PM system, or a patient engagement tool that uses text or email or voicemail reminders. Those are the kinds of things that you increase your access to, and you have the funding to maybe make the investment. On the other side of it, I think we all have to understand that these are data-driven decisions, and some practices lean heavier towards using data to make decisions, and some practices would rather not use data. What I can tell you relatively confidently is that the private equity investment is going to look at as many data points as they can. Typically, as I indicated earlier, you're not going to get private equity guiding the medicine, the clinical attention. I will say, however, that there's measurement on things like, how many cataract consults did I do that actually translated to surgery? What type of level 3 and level 4 codes are we using? What's that mix per physician? I think most of us would agree that knowing the data is a good thing. The challenge becomes when that becomes somewhat dictatorial. And I think that's the reputation that can be a bit misunderstood. I will also say that as these deals are happening in today's world, there's more scrutiny than there used to be. Let me put it to you in the context of buying a house. When you buy your house, maybe rates are 2.5%. What you realize is that, okay, maybe the basement leaked and the plumbing's not great, but I'll look past that. In this scenario, with rates being high, the level of scrutiny is amplified quite a bit. So that message is probably uncomfortable to some, and that may translate to a little bit of perceived lack of freedom. I think ultimately the last thing I would say is this is like an interview. This is a marriage, and you want to get to know the people that you're with. You want to understand their personalities. Past performance indicates future behavior, meaning who have they done this with? What do they know? What's the reputations? Talk with physicians that have joined this private equity group, and really get a level of comfort so that there aren't any significant surprises, and the negative piece that is associated with lack of freedom maybe is understood going in. So like I said earlier, it's not right for everybody. What I think is right is educating yourself on whether or not it's a fit.
Very, very, very detailed answer. So thank you. But you said, I want to pick up on one thing you said. You said marriage. And so I had the word in my head, prenup. So So let's say you're a practice that's looking to potentially do this, and you're concerned that the culture you've built over the years is going to be sacrificed. Have you ever seen instances where, for lack of a better word, prenup, but and some type of a agreement ahead of time to really spell these things out, to say, okay, you're gonna control X, I'm gonna control Y, we're gonna negotiate on Z. Have you ever seen anything like that?
Yeah, not only have I seen it, but it's almost standard protocol. Those are the core things that you want to be aware of. And the more detail you put into the contract, the more you can meet expectations on both sides. So absolutely. And recognize, as I said earlier, this doesn't happen in a day. So you're really courting for a while, and you're getting to know, as issues come up, how both sides will be dealing with a challenge. I think absolutely there's documented language that is used to ensure that culturally there's a fit, there's knowledge of who owns various issues. The worst case scenario is when you're surprised, and that's part of what the process should really eliminate, is any kind of surprise. There's nothing wrong with bringing up a scenario to your new sponsor saying, we have to deal with this employee or this issue. How would you deal with it, and who would own it? I think those are extremely common conversations that are really good to avoid that, that moment when you say, wow, I didn't expect that. And I think that, if you do your process right, those are the kind of moments that are few and far between.
Right. And what about trends? Like, I don't have any facts and figures to give you percentages of this happening, but it seems like I hear it a lot and more often these days about different practices selling to a private equity firm. So is it good? Is it a bad thing? Is it a good thing? I know I'm trying to pin you down on a answer, but and again, it probably depends, but are these trends good or bad?
Yeah, so let's talk about the trends that are driving these moves. I think first and foremost, you're talking about the aging population, reimbursement rates that last time I checked aren't going up. They're at best they're staying flat. Sometimes they're dropping. The fact is that there is more compliance risk than there ever has been. Cybersecurity is a word that we use now that 10 years ago we didn't use. There is definitely a need for practices to have their hands on more pieces of the business. Even post-COVID, things like PPP reimbursement, all of those things have made the business of ophthalmology, and frankly, the business of medicine, more complex. I think those are some of the drivers that are making people scratch their head and say, maybe I can get some help. And I think when those services, those shared services, are deployed in a positive way with great experience, then there is some relief from practices that were doing their best to keep their head above water on so many of the pieces of compliance and all the legal things that we talked about. On the other side, as we indicated, you may have all those things wired. You may have a great handle on those things, and you've got a great team that is already doing that. And you may not need that expertise or that ability to have some guidance. I think it depends on where you are. The reinforced point that I'll make for you is, if you are doing those things really well, you can certainly parlay that into education for the larger group. If you're doing it really well, no private equity wants to come in and displace what you're doing really well. The goal is to enhance areas where you may need some help and not displace areas that you're doing really well. And like I said, an attractive practice is probably going to get a higher multiple and a little bit more on the sale price.
Makes sense. I mean, it sounds all very logical to me. I think we keep going back to, I think it depends. Every situation is unique, and
that's right.
You have to treat it as such. So what are your predictions for the future? Do you see these trends continuing to grow in ophthalmology or other specialties?
Yeah, I was thinking about predictions, and every conference I go to, someone sits on stage and says, let's predict the market. And I think there was a famous philosopher, Lao Tzu, who said, those that have knowledge don't predict, those who predict don't have knowledge. What I would tell you is, here's what I've heard. And this isn't Jeff's prediction, but this is what I've heard. The headwinds are very real on the debt markets, which means it's just more costly to borrow money. And when it's more costly to borrow money, you are likely seeing less big, large, massive investment. Most people are sort of calling 2023, maybe even 2024, the year of the tuck-in, which is a term used for, you got a big platform and you're adding the 10 doc practice, maybe the 15 doc practice or the 2 doc practice. That's sort of a tuck-in. It's an in-market affiliation. I don't think that trend is going to go away, and that's what most people are saying. It's not going away because of those factors we talked about: aging population, more complex legal pieces, higher challenges on the compliance side, reimbursement rate cuts, staffing is clearly front and center in everybody's world. So until those things get solved, which, I mean, I'm a realist, I don't think they'll ever completely get solved, you're likely to see continued investment. The one important point that I want to reemphasize is that investment is only going to happen when you are a practice that is well run, has a good infrastructure in place, IT, et cetera. You are doing a lot of the right things. If you're doing those, it's great for a sale. If you're doing those, it's great if you're not selling. That's the attention that I think we all have to sort of get back to. What are the basics and how do we actually run the practice well so that our patient experience is, first and foremost, it's top notch, and the systems we have in place actually make somebody walk out and say, I'd recommend that place. I love my doctor. I love the staff. It was efficient. It was smooth. It was appropriately priced. So I think that's sort of the best level prediction I can give you based on where we are in the market today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff. I didn't know we were going to get so deep in a private equity conversation, and you were going to quote the Tao Te Ching. I've actually read some as when you said Lao Tzu, I knew what you were talking about.
Yeah. I didn't expect it either, but it came up.
So let's wrap up the conversation. If a practice is considering this, are there any resources out there to help them?
Yeah, it's a big decision. Do I want to get a lawyer ahead of time? You'll get bombarded by an entity called an investment bank. These are advisors that tell you, I'm going to package you up and take you out to market. A lot of folks, because these are costly, a lot of folks might consider doing that themselves. I mean, it's a decision you have to make. Do I spend multiple thousands of dollars on an investment bank who's going to essentially create this booklet that will be pushed out to the private equity folks? Think about this as a FSBO, for sale by owner, or I'm going to get a real estate person. The analogy is not exact, but I think it makes sense. So investment banks, lawyers, financial accountants, all those are entities that, depending on where you are in terms of your process and your capability, you're going to make an investment. I think the tighter you are with EMR, PM, RCM, and the way it actually rolls up into a nice packet, the less you need investment banks, financial advice. You will ultimately need a lawyer, though. Make no mistake about it. There's a requirement of a lawyer, and frankly, most practices currently have legal guidance today. So those are all questions that you really ask yourself based on how serious you are and where you are today.
Yeah, makes sense. Great advice. Well, Jeff, I just want to thank you so much for joining me today and talking about private equity and ophthalmology, a very interesting topic. I appreciate it very much. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We were great partners in this. I thought it was a great opportunity to help folks get educated, and look forward to seeing you at Askers.
Sounds great. I also want to take a moment to thank our listeners. We appreciate each and every one of you. We cannot do what we do without you. If you like our podcast, kindly share it with your friends and on social media. Also, please don't forget to write a review on iTunes or Google Play. Your reviews will help other doctors and practice owners find us. Till we meet again, wishing all of you an amazing week ahead.